Hi, everyone. Very excited to be here and to have all of you here today. Thank you for coming. This is the latest installment in our Chasing Consciousness series. YHouse, for those of you who don't already know, is a multidisciplinary institute of scientists and scholars who are interested in learning more about the nature and origin of awareness and consciousness. YHouse believes in breaking down walls between disciplines, between universities and the general public. Public engagement and dialogue is a huge part of what YHouse believes in and practices. So that's why we're so happy to host an event like this, where we'll have an exciting and stimulating discussion and then an opportunity for the audience to participate. So with that said, I'd like to introduce our guest for this evening. Bo Van Riper is a historian who writes about the social and cultural dimensions of modern science and technology and the stories we tell ourselves about them. He's written about rockets and missiles, atomic bombs, fossil mammoths, rock and roll monster movies, zombie outlaws, Japanese westerns, time-traveling heroes, and why, in cartoons, gravity only affects you when you stop to think about it. Chuck Adler, professor of physics at St. Mary's College, Maryland, author of award-winning book Wizards, Aliens, and Starships, which uses the physics of disapparition in Harry Potter as a pedagogical tool and tells us how life in the universe could last a Google years. He's a renowned teacher and thinker on the relationship of science to science fiction and on current boundaries in physics. Gentlemen, it's great to have you both here today. What we thought we would do is let each of you speak for maybe 5 minutes, and then we'll begin a conversation. So, we have the. Are these on?
Yeah.
Okay. Bo, would you like to?
Actually.
Oh, I'm sorry. Pardon, Chuck. Want to take us away?
Yes. All right. So thank you for coming here. As we said, we're going to talk about the issue of the dangers and potentials of artificial life. Now, from 1920, when the play Rossum's Universal Robots was first produced, and which coined the term robot, through the Terminator movies to the Cylons of both the old and the new Battlestar Galactica, there has been one theme common for most robots in popular literature. Kill all humans. The question is, why is that? Let's talk about why that might be so. Now, to do so, I'm not going to actually choose any of the more obvious examples from this. I'm not going to talk about the Cylons or the robots in Rossum's Universal Robots, or any of the myriad examples that one might have. Instead, I would like to actually talk about someone or a figure that I consider one of the most tragic figures in all of modern science fiction. C-3PO. Think about it. This guy was essentially hijacked onto a series of adventures that he really didn't want to go on to. I say he, but, you know, he's hijacked onto a series of adventures that he really did not want to go on to, in the process of which he was kidnapped, sold into slavery at the beginning of the first movie, dismembered in the second movie, and even before any of this happens, we learn also that at the end of the prequel series, he's mind-wiped. And you can't even blame the mind wipe on the evil empire, because it's actually a senator of the Old Republic that actually orders the mind wipe. Now, I want you to think about this. Robots under the Old Republic and under the Empire basically have no civil rights. They're expected essentially to do everything they're told to do. They portray any tasks which the humans essentially have them doing. They're essentially slaves. They have zero civil rights, as far as I can tell, under the Old Republic. You know, and it is amazing that, you know, C-3PO simply didn't hate all the people that he eventually served. If you look at it, if you think about this, there are actually some very disturbing things in these movies about the droids. If you think about the very beginning of the first movie, of the first movie, the prequel series, I should say, you have Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon Jinn going through and destroying wave after wave after wave of droids, which are attacking them as they're trying to gain access to a space station. I don't remember exactly. But if you think about it, if those droids actually had self-consciousness, then these Jedi are essentially mass murderers. They're basically destroying all these robots without any regard to the idea that these robots actually might have consciousness or feelings or anything like that. So one of the interesting things I want to talk about today is this issue of, what is it about, why, the idea that robots hate us, I think naturally stems from the fact that essentially, in much of literature, we actually essentially treat them as subservients and essentially as slaves.
So, that point when you were in your 20s and you made some cheap Freud joke and somebody said to you, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Well, here's the thing, a robot is never just a robot. If a robot shows up, if an android shows up, if an artificial intelligence shows up in any kind of a creative work, it's not just there to advance the plot. It's there to make some kind of a larger point because they're absolutely irresistible tools for doing that. Ever since human beings started to glom together in groups, there's been this thing about defining the line between those who are like us and those weird people over there who aren't like us. Ever since the Greeks defined barbarian as everybody who doesn't live in the hood here on the peninsula in the Mediterranean, ever since every culture that ever was came up with a word for itself that meant the people, there's been this implicit line between those like us and those not like us. Stephen Jay Gould, the great paleontologist, now the late great paleontologist, once said that it was only by an enormous bit of evolutionary luck that we as a species did not grow up alongside other hominid species that were similar to us, bipedal, opposable thumbs, big brains, and all that, and yet not of our species. That the Neanderthals, for example, or God help us, Homo erectus, didn't make it all the way down to the present and create a civil rights problem that makes the problems of races and ethnicities within human societies as we know them pale in comparison. Robots, cyborgs, AIs, androids allow us to trouble that boundary between the human and the not human in ways an order of magnitude beyond and an order of magnitude more complicated than human characters would ever allow us to do, especially as the 19th century gave way to the 20th century and the notion that people of different races and ethnicities might actually not be as human as you became, if not entirely relegated to the dustbin of history, at least something that you wouldn't express in polite society. Robots, AIs, cyborgs, and so forth became a way to talk about what if there was a thing out there that was like us but not like us, that looked human, that acted human, that thought human, but that by God was just a collection of gears and pistons or a collection of artificially grown cells that were somehow, here a miracle occurs, accelerated from blob of protoplasm to second lead in your movie in the space of about a month and a half. So artificial life forms and artificial intelligences are a tool that we as a society use for poking at the edges of who we are and what makes us who we are, and for asking, well, what if? For defining the edge cases. And that's what makes them simultaneously fascinating and more than a little scary.
Thank you.
Well, I think that the issue of fear is kind of an interesting one because, in fact, even with the some of the best science fiction writers like Isaac Asimov, the handling of the robots actually seems to be dictated by a large fear from the humans that we've created something which is potentially even better than we are. For example, in Asimov's stories, he has the 3 laws of robotics, which essentially are designed to keep the robots under control. And the first law being that a robot may not harm a human being or by inaction cause a human being to come to harm. Second law being essentially against robots have to obey humans' commands.
Unless that would violate law number 1. You can't tell your robot, my neighbor's annoying me, go kill him.
Right. And
More's the pity.
Right. And the third law, which is actually perhaps the most problematic, is that the robot must preserve its own existence except when that would actually conflict with the first and second laws.
And the interesting thing about Asimov's laws is that they're wired into the basic programming of the robot. They're not coercively imposed on the robot from the outside, thou shalt not harm a human being. An Asimov robot is, in theory, no more capable of harming a human being than you are capable of holding your breath until your brain dies from lack of oxygen. It's built into the robot at such a fundamental level that the robot can't conceive of acting, in theory, in any other way. Of course, the point in Asimov's robot stories of the 40s and 50s is a robot does seem to have violated one of the 3 laws, and the heroine, Dr. Susan Calvin, has to figure out what's going on, in essence, to psychoanalyze the robot.
Right. And this, I think, was parodied by Douglas Adams to a certain extent, where, if you remember, the Serious Cybernetics Corporation told robots, your plastic pal who's fun to be with, which I think is kind of, and also, of course, presented Marvin the paranoid android, who was very, very far away from these ideals. But one of the things I've always wondered about is whether you could actually hardwire that into a conscious being's brain. Are these, are these things that you could actually put into a conscious being's brain? And if so, for a conscious being, what do these say about, again, the civil rights or the whatever the rights that robots have as sentient beings? Sorry,
I was just going to observe that one of the low-key disturbing things about Asimov's robots is that if you wanted to look at them with a jaded eye, they represent, if you were going to design the ideal worker or the ideal slave from the ground up, it would be Asimov's robots. They never talk back, they never complain, and by hardwiring the don't harm a human being into their brains, you've effectively, from the ground up, eliminated the nightmare that troubled antebellum Southern plantation owners. I mean, the great nightmare of the antebellum South was that you would be murdered in your bed by your property, which is enough to worry anybody. And Asimov gets around that by, in essence, creating a slave, if you want to look at it this darkly, that's happy to be a slave, as I think Chuck would argue Lucas did in C-3PO.
Yes, yeah. No, absolutely. I think it's, I think the movies kind of glossed over these points, and I think the Star Wars movies glossed over a number of issues there. But one, I don't know if you've read Stanislaw Lem's Robot Fables.
Sadly, I have not.
No. But
so you're all in good company.
Yeah, probably. But in Lem's stories, they're told from the perspective of the robots, who basically view humans as kind of disgusting pieces of grease and protoplasm, and essentially, it's a nice perspective flip on the stories of robots told from humans. But one of the things that Lem once wrote about robots, and in terms of the 3 laws, was that the loftiest intellect can't be the lowliest slave, meaning that he didn't think, in fact, that the 3 laws would actually work in some sense. But
and this actually goes to something we were talking about before the thing started, is that there's a deeply rooted assumption in a lot of robot stories especially from the mid-20th century on, that if you're going to design an intelligent robot, if you're going to design an artificially intelligent computer, of course you design it to be omnicompetent. Robbie the Robot in Forbidden Planet, the great 1956 space opera, that sort of prefigures Star Trek, is this gigantic lumbering thing that looks like the offspring of the Michelin Man and, you know, some leftovers from your local steel foundry. And yet it has a skill set that ranges from being able to turn out a lovely light blue frock for the leading lady to creating scotch by the 50-gallon drum and 20 or 30 dozen other things. HAL in 2001 is enormously broadly competent. And creating those kinds of characters sets up the question, what if we create something that's smarter than we are and try to make it our servant? Is it going to, as Chuck said, is it going to, as Lem said, is it going to stand for that? Is it going to be willing to be Jeeves, to be the ever-present helpful servant and not stretch the full range of its capabilities with which it's been programmed?
Speaking of, if I can just jump in for a second, guys. Speaking of, it seems like in the early literature, right, there was a lot of emphasis on we are the humans, those are the robots. Are they going to come after us? But as we see more and more advances with artificial intelligence, it seems to me like the real fear right now is, are we going to use robots against each other? Right? I'm less afraid of a autonomous weapon system achieving sentience and coming after me as much as I'm afraid of somebody else sicking it on me. I was at work the other day in an office that had a robot that just wanders around and monitors everybody, and it has cameras and audio, and it just records everything. And everybody was thinking, "Oh, that's so cool!" I'm older, you know. The millennials were like, "That's a pretty cool, awesome thing," and I was like, "I don't know. I grew up when it was still okay to be paranoid." And they said, "Well, what are you worried about?" And I said, "Well, how many of us do you think? What are the odds that one of us are going to get promoted based on what that thing recorded?" And everybody sort of looked around, and I thought, you know, maybe that'll happen. I would love it. But what are your thoughts on do you see anything changing in our literature, in our art, reflecting anxieties about AI and how we use it against each other or other contemporary dangers?
Great question. I think what you're seeing is a shift away from the omnicompetent robot or the omnicompetent AI to the incredibly narrowly focused AI or the incredibly narrowly focused robot that does one thing phenomenally well. I mean, be it Deep Blue playing chess, be it your average drone flying around taking pictures of people, be it Alexa controlling your house. We're still, as you say, at the, oh wow, isn't that cool stage. I don't think we've seen yet the first real wave of films, of television series, of novels that I'm aware of that go to the what would happen if some malevolent person decided to use these cute, cuddly, innocuous cylinders on everybody's living room table to achieve some horrible end to benefit themselves or to benefit some larger evil conspiracy. The question is, when somebody does start telling those stories, what are they going to look like?
Well, there was actually the novel Demon, which is a fairly recent novel, which actually played a little bit into that, although I think it was somewhat over the top, in which a genius computer programmer kind of sabotages the internet and essentially causes all of these AI-controlled but non-intelligent bots in this, some just software, some hardware, to sort of sabotage the entire World Wide Web and start basically benefiting the people he wanted to benefit, and killing off or punishing the people that he wanted to punish. I don't think we're quite at that level yet, but the one thing which was interesting to me was recently we was talking about the issue of basically making computers better and better at things like chess or Go, is that computers have there was about a year ago, I think, a professor at Georgia Tech put together an AI course room assistant for his class, for one of his classes, I think, on database management. And this class had a jillion students in it, 200, 300 students in it, and he didn't have enough TAs for it. So he actually put together an AI system that could answer students' questions, but he didn't actually tell the students that it was an AI. They actually thought it was another TA for the class. He named it Jill Watson, and students actually did not realize that Jill Watson was, in fact, an AI routine answering the questions for them. And in fact, some of them were actually kind of shocked when this turned out to be an AI. And I don't. There's a famous test called the Turing test, which Alan Turing put together back in the 1940s, in which he proposed a test of artificial intelligence being that a human being would basically communicate with an unseen correspondent via computer monitor. And the question was, could you actually tell if this was a computer or an artificial intelligence? Well, that's what this professor did. Just created a system which will actually pass the Turing test. But I don't think anyone's going to argue that it's actually a real person, though. But there are these stories also about bots meddling in the recent elections as well. People thinking that, in fact, these things spreading,
It's just to throw in one thing quickly on that. It struck me that that thing that happened a couple of weeks ago was it Alexa, or laughing maniacally for no reason. The extent to which that weirded people out suggests the level of anxiety bubbling below the surface, and because it strikes me that what's disturbing about that is the realization in that instant that there might be things going on in that little black cylinder that you have no that it's not sharing with you. It's the computer version of it's 10 o'clock. Do you know where your children are? Alexa hasn't spoken to you for a while. Do you know what it's using those computing cycles to think about? Anyway,
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the Turing test. Alex Garland directed a film called Ex Machina, and in that film, for those of you who haven't seen it, it was about this kind of maniac genius who created robots that were so lifelike that his Turing test was not, do you think that it's a person, but will you fall in love with it? and the robot passed the Turing test, and it's a disturbing film. And there's a film, AMC, I think, partnered with BBC to make a film called Humans about...
a TV show.
TV show, right, yeah. And it's great. It's a great show. I recommend it. But there's a lot in there about people kind of falling in love with robots and stuff. And what are your thoughts on love and sex and artificial life?
Well, if I can take the TV show Humans, it's a wonderful show. And in there... they actually have their two things going along with that, which are very interesting, which is that in one part of the show, the father of the main family is associated with these. By the way, I should mention that in the show, the robots, the androids, are basically not sentient, except for a small group of, I think, about 5 of them that were given sentience by one of the original creators of these droids. And the owner of the house does not realize that the computer he's dealing with is sentient. In fact, she is in fact under a software block that actually does not allow her to control her own body for various plot reasons. But the human being essentially then goes, the father of the house, for various reasons of the plot, disables the 18 plus controls on the robot. I don't remember what it was called in there, but then essentially has sex with the robot, not knowing in fact that it's a sentient being. And so this is essentially presented as rape in the show, and it treated as such. And he's forgiven by the robot, but it's treated very, very ambiguously in the show. And I thought that was just a wonderful thing about the show, that they would actually treat on that. And another part of the show, I think that, I'm spoiling it like heck here, so sorry for that, but in another part of the show, a policeman falls in love with his robot partner, again, the partner, but he does not realize that in fact his partner is actually an android. They're very, very lifelike in almost every way. I think it is very interesting. I think one more part of the show was that another human being who realizes, in fact, that the robots are not conscious, essentially treats the robot as he would treat his own son. And even though the robot is falling apart, he treats it very much like he would treat a child with an incurable disease, as it's slowly, quote unquote, dying. And this, he's essentially told, in fact, at some point, you realize it has no self-awareness. And he said, yeah, I do, but that doesn't really matter to me. And I think that points out one thing which I think Bo alluded to as well, this issue of Alexa kind of laughing maniacally and weirding out people, is that a lot of AI may have a lot more to do with human intellect and how actually little we understand our own intellects, in that we tend to view things. One of the things that people are very good at are seeing patterns, whether in fact they exist or not. And in fact, a lot of I think the weirdness that we have about these things happening, about things that are very human but not human, or intelligent seeming but not actually intelligent, has to do with the fact that we actually start creating a pattern in our mind of the person that we are talking to on the other end, even if there is no person there.
So I'm going to be, for once, on the optimistic person here, and suggest that although mentioning robots and sex in the same sentence tends to trigger reactions of ew, I think there's actually significant potential there. I mean, think a generation or two down the line. Think about an AI that not only passes the Turing test, but passes the Turing test so well that it never even occurs to you that you're not interacting with another human consciousness. Now, it's been observed, and it's one of those things like Richard Nixon has a face like a foot. Once you've heard it, it's hard to get it out of your head. It's been observed that the old, in sexual relationships, women seek emotional gratification and men seek physical gratification. It's been observed that that's actually not entirely true. Because if it was true, vibrator sales wouldn't be anywhere near as highly as they are. And men who can, and anatomy being what it is, gratify themselves perfectly well without help, would not patronize sex workers in the numbers that they do. The hypothesis among some psychologists is that men patronize sex workers because they're seeking not just physical gratification, but an emotional connection with somebody as they do. What if you had a robot, a human-looking robot with a high-level AI that could simulate that kind of emotional interaction? And what if that kind of partner was available to people who, for whatever reason, preferred a non-human partner that could provide them not just with physical gratification of their sexual desires, but also emotional gratification to go along with it? And now at this point, somebody in the back is going, yes, yes, but humans, we're meant to be with other humans. And okay, fair enough. And, you know, being with another human who loves you and cares for you deeply on, you know, in all the broad spectrum of ways that we hope we find someone who cares about us in, great. But not all movies made in the 1930s were Gone with the Wind or The Wizard of Oz. Some of them were Francis the Cocking Mule Goes to College. Some of them were low-grade schlock that was not very gratifying even at the time and that you couldn't bear to sit through now. Trust me, I've sat through them. Is a robot sex partner better than a genuinely loving, caring mate who is totally into you? No, probably not, and probably never. Is it better than the person in the dead, loveless marriage that you're stuck in for whatever reason? Is it better than no partner at all in terms of maintaining your mental health? Is it better than somebody who's been forced by circumstances into sex work? Yeah, maybe. Of course, this only works if we're sure that the robot in question is not a conscious, sentient being with civil rights. If they cross that line, then all the benefit evaporates because then they've become a human made out of a different line of parts than flesh and blood humans.
I don't know.
Sorry, I didn't mean to lead you down a dark hole.
No. You mentioned earlier that robots were a stand-in in literature for people to explore their humanity or poke around at the edges. And I've often wondered if it isn't also just a way to explore in concentrated form how our feelings about how we treat each other. It seems, at least with humans, and with really almost everything, that the shift that's taken place is that we're more and more sympathetic to the plight of the robots. And I wonder if that's just because as a society we're hopefully getting to the point where we're actually thinking about the exploited or the oppressed and identifying with them instead of always identifying with the masters and the people on top. What do you think? Do you have any thoughts about class and robots in literature or art?
I think you're right in the big sense. I think it's not necessarily a linear, we used to be clueless about it and we've gotten clueful. Because if you look at Rossum's Universal Robots, it's very much a class metaphor. Okay. It's very much the evil bosses create the perfect mindless workers only to discover that the mindless workers aren't so mindless and it's not all working out the way they wanted it to. And yet, on the other hand, you'd go a generation up into the 1950s, and you've got robots in movies, in television, the 50s, the early 60s, the robot in Lost in Space, Robbie in Forbidden Planet, various others, where it never even occurs to the human characters to think that the robot is anything more than a tool, than a servant, than a handy piece of equipment to have around the house. So I think there's that how we treat each other thing is very definitely part of what's going on there. And one of the interesting things to look at in fictional depictions of robots is how that ebbs and flows in different stories, different genres, different time periods.
I think, yeah, I was thinking about that in terms of like robot as murderer to get rid of human overlords, and I'm trying to think of where actually that started being a thing. Is it? I mean, is it? It doesn't quite fit Hal from 2001. But
well, within the confines of the spaceship, he only has 5 human overlords, and he goes 4 for 5.
No, maybe not so bad. Then.
You could do that, and with Major League Pitching, you'd make $1 million.
There's Westworld, although again that was just faulty programming. Is it?
That's true. Thinking here about the original
The original
1970s
Westworld,
Westworld, where the robots at a Disney World-like theme park go berserk and murder the humans.
Is it the Terminator movies, or is it before then? Because I'm not thinking of anything really much before the 1980s, before we actually start seeing the robots as hyper-efficient killing machines.
I think it really comes into its own with the Terminator. Well, no, Colossus.
Right.
Colossus, the Forbin project, about a U.S. supercomputer and a Soviet supercomputer who the humans in charge of the American project unwisely decide should be allowed to talk to each other. Now, if they'd only have watched a few more science fiction movies, they'd know this was a terrible idea. But the computers prefiguring Skynet and the Terminator movies immediately decide that they should take over the world and subjugate these obnoxious blobs of protoplasm that keep running around yapping at them. And Colossus, the movie, ends with a shout of defiance from the chief human scientist, "We'll never bow down to you." And you can just sort of imagine the computer sitting there going, "Yeah, you keep telling yourself that, buddy." How did we get there?
I don't know.
I don't know.
We're talking about the issue of humans, compassion towards humans going. I think it may have. I think it has a lot more to do with prevailing societal issues at the time than possibly a sort of a linear progression. I think you get. I mean, we're dealing with, again, the TV shows nowadays have a lot more compassion towards robots, but I think that may be more of an issue because issues involving things like immigration or compassion to the other or issues involving civil rights have come more to the forefront. That's just a guess, though. I don't know.
I think we're also more conscious of in recent years of the less visible diversity of human beings, the diversity of ways in which human brains can be wired, the diversity of ways in which human emotions can express themselves. I mean, even compared to when you and I were undergraduates back in the days when the Earth was cooling, we're far more conscious that diversity in human beings is not just about skin color and things like that. And that goes directly, I think, to the whole robot AI android issue, because it's never in robot stories, for the most part, that robots are physically indistinguishable from humans. It's usually that there's something about their socialization, their way of speaking. I mean, you look at Data in Star Trek: The Next Generation, and even if he was a perfect duplicate of a human being, the way he presents himself in social situations, you would instantly assume he was a mechanical being.
Except, sorry to interrupt
no,
you, but I
please.
feel like one of the most innovative parts of Battlestar Galactica, the remake, was that the Cylons were
yes.
indistinguishable, and then
Yeah.
they were tortured, and that was during the enhanced interrogation darkness in our
yes.
history. And I thought it.
No, absolutely fair point, and I hadn't thought about that, and and indeed that's one of the single most striking difference between the remake of Battlestar Galactica and the original. I mean, in the original, the Cylons are not just flat out robots, but robots conceived in the most spectacularly over the top lavender chrome disco robot fashion imaginable. And the remake goes in exactly the other direction, taking a leaf out of Blade Runner. What if you literally could not distinguish the artificial life forms from the flesh and blood life forms?
One thing which I loved about the remake of Battlestar was how the humanoid Cylons actually discriminated against the older Cylons, where I think someone made a comment that there's no reason that these older models are any less intelligent than we are, but they put a block on them somehow to make them actually subservient to the newer class of Cylons, which I thought was just a very beautiful point that the new series made.
Yeah, I agree. That was an amazing series, really. What about opening up to questions from the audience?
Absolutely.
Okay. Does anybody want to chime in? Or? Hi.
Yes. So I think you've made a brilliant. I think you've made a very convincing case that robots will soon replace sex workers.
Well, my work here is done.
Yeah, there we go.
Which leads to a much larger question of what is our society going to look like in terms of the labor force? What are human beings going to do? Truck drivers are being replaced, taxi drivers, Uber people are going to be replaced, God forbid. How are we going to occupy our time? The class issues, is this going to lead to an America or certain parts of America that are completely run by robots and benefit from them, and other parts that are, unemployed?
I wish I could say that's not plausible, but I think it's actually highly plausible. The scenario you just painted. I think I strongly suspect that Isaac Asimov wrote a story called Sally, in which he actually posited future by the year 2057, humans were actually not allowed to drive cars anymore because of the dangers associated with people driving cars. I don't see that as implausible anymore. I think 2057 might actually be a fairly decent guess for a time when, in fact, no human beings actually drove cars anymore. That's an excellent question, and I'm not sure I know. I'm not going to try to predict the future, but I could, in fact, see a society in which most of work we associate now with, I guess, what is driving considered skilled labor, semi-skilled labor?
I'd say semi-skilled labor. I mean, I don't know if that's the actual definition, but I think it would qualify as that.
But there's actually been I think there have been tests of robot bricklayers, for example, recently. I saw this in the news, and again, the idea that you could basically have a robot building a house now instead of humans building a house. We've gotten to the robotics to the point where I think they can replace essentially any sort of labor that involves, this sort of again, semi-skilled construction work or transportation or almost anything like that. I think we're on the verge of that. We're not quite there yet, but
I think the answer may be that, okay, the optimistic answer, and I should note that it's slightly terrifying that this is the optimistic answer, is that, as was the case when the production of textiles was mechanized in the 1770s and 1780s, there's going to be massive shifts in who's employed and how people are employed and so on and so forth as the technology transitions. When you go from hand looms to power looms, the number of people you need to operate the looms to produce the same amount of cloth drops precipitously, and you've suddenly got an awful lot of weavers out of work. Eventually, over the course of a period of time, the economy shifts, and the job and the people who would have become weavers a generation or two ago go off and become something else, maybe something further up the scale of skill level, or maybe not. The problem is that those kinds of shifts in the economy historically have run on time scales significantly longer than the amount of time your average individual can afford to remain out of work while they figure out where they're going to land in the new economy. Also, so the optimistic answer is yes, unskilled and semi-skilled jobs will disappear, but that'll free up more humans to do things that robots can't do. The pessimistic thing is that there's a limit to how many jobs that robots can't do you need in a society, and that number of jobs is significantly exceeded by the number of humans that are employed in the current economy, which goes to all kinds of interesting socioeconomic stuff, like should we start paying people a universal basic income in order to divorce work from bare survival? And if we do that, how do we, in the West, especially in the United States, break 4 or 5 centuries worth of cultural conditioning that equates self-worth with paid employment, and which causes people who've worked their entire lives to suddenly, when they can finally retire, feel utterly lost and rudderless? How do we keep that from being a society-wide epidemic and kicking in at 25 or 30 or 35, not 65?
We have a microphone.
Yeah, so I definitely think that it's reasonable that we're concerned about robots taking over jobs. And I think I had a friend told me that he thinks the truck industry in the United States, which is a very significant industry, is going to be the first one to be impacted because of the advancements that we've had in the driverless cars. And so those will be the people that we're talking about right now that will be impacted in maybe like 10 years, soon as 10 years. So my question is not quite related, or it's not quite about us losing our jobs, but earlier to the question you asked about relationships. So you said that one day we could be getting both like emotional and physical gratification from robots, and you said that could be better than not having someone at all, or be like in a like loveless marriage, right? But I think that's the bigger question we need to ask, because when we're in a relationship with a robot, the reason people get into relationships and fall in love is to reproduce, right? So it's to advance the species. But if people are falling in love with robots who are not biologically able to produce, that might change the scene for reproduction, and like would the species start dying off? And so you can already kind of see that, even though we don't have people falling in love with robots and not reproducing to that extent. You can see it in like countries like Japan, where the population is going down because the men there are not interested in relationships. And the reason for that is because like the culture of Japan kind of has shifted towards, the men can kind of get all that gratification and they're not forming families, they're just kind of working. So I was wondering about your thoughts on like the future of the species from that perspective.
How will robots affect fertility rates?
I think if I had to guess, there will always be at least some amount of the species who's actually interested in human relationships and in having and keeping the species going. It's a really good question. I think that one of the plot points of RUR, in fact, was that humans stopped reproducing because of the robots. Although I don't think they ever said explicitly it was because. Maybe it was implied. I don't know that people. It's something I've never heard. Maybe it was implied in the play that this is because people were seeking intimacy with the robots. The play. I don't know, but you could almost. You might argue that as I think. Sorry, I'm being a little scatterbrained. You'd almost argue that as almost a plus in some sense, in that people are very, very worried about the issue of the world population and decreasing I don't know. That's decreasing population rates is decreasing population rates is probably more of a good thing than a bad thing. It's not a good answer to the question, I realize.
Well, let me stake out a position on both ends of the spectrum
Yeah, there we go.
simultaneously, because that way, whichever way the discussion goes, I'm covered. On the one hand, I tend to agree with Chuck that there's going to be, for the foreseeable many generations to come future, a deeply wired urge among humans to not just have a relationship, but to somehow have a little human being or several little human beings that you mold in your own image from the time they come into your life, and that will live on after you, and people will say to them, "Ah, yes, I look at you and I see your mother in you, your father in you. Yes, you have your mother's laugh, you have your father's terrible taste in knock-knock jokes," or whatever. I think that's an enormously powerful urge, and I don't think the availability of robots to stop when you want to have fun on a Saturday night is going to drive that out of existence. But just to go to the other end of the spectrum, the point of form a stable pair bond, have kids, pass on your DNA, continue the species, has always been because mating and producing flesh and blood children has always been the only way we've had of reproducing the species. You may have heard the old Werner von Braun joke. Somebody asked him, "Why do you put people in spacecraft?" And he thought about it for a second and said, "Because a human being is the only general purpose computer that can be mass produced by unskilled labor." But if we're living in a world of human-like intelligent robots, how many steps are we from the possibility where, if you want an offspring that carries on, your legacy on into the future, you have the option not just of taking your chance with a human partner in the roll of the genetic dice, but building or having somebody build for you a biomechanical offspring into which you can download a consciousness that represents you, or part you and part your partner, or part you and part your beloved grandfather. Now, how far out is that? I'm guessing well down the line, next century after that. But if that's the case, it may be that, will the species continue? The answer is yes, but not in the way we were used to thinking of.
Robots are our next evolutionary step.
There we go. Yeah.
It's been put out there more than once in recent years.
Looks like we have a question in the back.
Thank you. My name is Michael Smolens. I have a technology company, and I'd be very curious for people who ask questions to introduce, to find out who they are, because I had never heard of YHouse until Thursday night, and I was at an event hearing Chris Hughes, who was Mark Zuckerberg's roommate at Harvard, speak, and he has a book out that he is now supporting it's called Fair Shot Rethinking Inequality, and he's talking about the guaranteed personal income from a completely different perspective. And someone at that event told me about YHouse. So that's why I'm here, and this is just fascinating. I'm just very curious if we can get either attendees as to what brings people here, and the discussion is absolutely fabulous. And I think also the people that are curious about the discussion is something that's extremely valuable as well. So just as a comment like that, I think it's very, very terrific of what you're doing.
Thanks, Michael. Please hang around afterwards. There's always a little time to mingle and meet people, and we have a strong community, so we'll be eager to meet you. Hi.
Hi. So I work in cybersecurity, and wondering, today I think the first person was killed by an Uber car.
Right. Yes.
So there's just as much risk from a cyber attack from a computer to kill someone. So I guess, do you think that government regulation would stop a computer from achieving sentience based on the risk that someone could take control of it?
Can I have the screen actually back to the presentation? Yeah, that's a wonderful question, by the way.
Well, and then I guess what lines of code do you think would need to be put in to stop? What segments do you put in lines of code to say if this is a conditional statement, then shut yourself off? At what point do you do that?
Actually, I was actually thinking. Oddly enough, I was thinking about this earlier today. Actually, I was looking this up, and I think that this is actually not the first time that someone's been killed, at least by a self-driving car. I think there was another fatality about a year and a half ago, but not by Uber. I've got it in the notes here somewhere. I will say this. This is a little bit off topic, but I'm a little concerned about the numbers for this. I was trying to figure out exactly how many self-driving cars there are on the road right now, and it's not a huge number. It's probably less than about 1,000. And if you think about self-driving cars have been more or less around for maybe 3 years or so, and extrapolating from really, really, really bad data, okay, but you have essentially 2 fatal accidents of order 1,000 cars in 3 years. That's about 1 fatality per 10,000 cars per year, which if you then replace all the cars in the United States with self-driving cars, extrapolating horribly without any justification for using these statistics, but if you extrapolate that out, that amounts to, assuming there are, call it 100 million cars in the US, it's probably a lowball estimate, so 10, 4 is, of order of 10,000 fatalities a year. So which is, I think, about what we have right now, if not actually even a little bit higher.
6,000 car versus pedestrian fatalities in 2017, and total vehicular fatalities in the States tends to hover around 30 to 35K a year. Okay. Remaining constant even as the safety of cars increases.
Yeah.
So basically half of Vietnam every year.
Right. So again, extrapolating from data which is very, very bad, you're looking at something which is actually somewhat similar. Again, assuming that there are no improvements in safety. I actually had an idea for a science fiction story about this, which is that if you go into the future, maybe 20 or 30 years, when in fact self-driving trucks have replaced all human truck drivers. And again, they're touted as being safer because they don't suffer from fatigue. They know immediately what's on the road all around them. They have all these features built in. What's to prevent companies from starting to do things like companies do today with, basically forcing truck drivers or encouraging truck drivers to drive much longer than they really can, to speed where they can't? What's to stop them from messing with the code to actually make them drive a little bit faster, to make them, make them push the safety limits a little bit more, to try to make a bigger profit? I can see something like that very easily happening and increasing the number of fatalities with self-driven cars. And I think that's something like that would be very, very hard to spot. I mean, if you look how long Volkswagen got away with it, with their emissions stuff for, I think, a decade or so.
I'm going to jump in here, and to your question about is the government likely to step in and severely restrict or ban this technology because of the potential for misuse, and say not if it gets to the point where it's profitable or where there's a clear and obvious use. I used to teach courses at a engineering school on science, technology, and society, and one of my stock one-liners to students was, the ban on human genetic manipulation in utero will last exactly 10 minutes longer than it takes somebody to produce a viable way to edit out cystic fibrosis or Tay-Sachs or some other hideous early death inherited genetic condition, at which point the groundswell of push for implementing this will overwhelm any kind of moral, sociological, regulatory objection. Generally speaking, technologies get smothered in the cradle not because somebody thinks they're going to have horrendous knock-on effects for society. And if somebody can think of one that was for that reason and it stuck, I'd love to know, because I'm really short of good examples. Technologies that get smothered in the cradle tend to be because the market didn't want them, like the SST or the Segway. Yeah, it's great, but what do you do with it? If somebody's got an answer for what can you do with it that'll turn a profit, you can make all the speeches you want on the floor of the Senate or the lawn of the Capitol, and it's going to be coming to a street near you in 2 or 3 years.
Yep. I'm going to piggyback on that and say that, in fact, from what I can tell, self-driving cars seem to exist in a fair amount of legal limbo right now, in that I don't think Arizona is even one of the states that has regulations dealing with them. And I don't think Arizona is one of the states that's actually invested in trying to look into legal issues involving self-driving cars. So,
classic science, technology, and society problem. Our technology always evolves faster than the regulatory structure we try to wrap around it, and the law is always playing catch up. Just ask a family law attorney sometime what in vitro fertilization and the ability to have surrogate womb mothers did to notions of child custody in this country. It's horrifying. I mean, not that you can do these things, but the mismatch between the technology and the antiquated laws is horrifying.
And I think, actually, one more comment on this, which is
then I think we've got a question up front.
I think that, in fact, we are actually about to see this take off as well. Number one, I think the number has almost doubled number of self-driving cars almost doubled every year for the last several years, indicating we might be seeing an exponential growth in the numbers. But number two, if you think about the companies that are actually investing in it, Google, Apple, GM, are all major investors in self-driving cars. Elon Musk's company, they are all huge companies, and they would not be investing in these so heavily if they didn't see a future in it. So I think we're actually going to see a decade of really interesting legal stuff going on there, and also some very interesting issues in programming problems.
I think you had your hand up first.
Thank you. Sorry, what? Good. So good point. So I work in artificial life. So I build simulations of those things at a very basic level, and we try to analyze how they have properties that make them autonomous and so on. And my question is, as someone who is working in this field, I'm wondering how much scary ideas can affect much more people thinking about this than like any kind of research that is being done. We seem to see a lot of articles and a lot of people talk much more about those scary driving cars that can kill you against statistics that are actually being computed, or we hear a lot about super intelligence and how those things that are going to become more intelligent then humans are actually going to kill us at some point. Those are very complicated but scary ideas, or I don't know. Maybe it's simple ideas that are scary. I don't know. It's not the simplest things that I would think would come about first. Maybe something as simple as someone malevolent trying to use drones plus AI. You combine those two things, and then you kill a lot of people because of weaponry being allowed or being available, and you just install that on a drone, and here you go. That's AI that is accessible now. You combine an AI and something else that is, under-regulated, and then you get to a much more dangerous point right away within a few years. Superintelligence seems so far away. Why are we so scared about this? Self-driving cars are also improving our lives so far. There is until today. It seems, but it seems like we care a lot about those scary ideas. Do we? Maybe the fictions that we make up in our heads are so powerful that they should be regulated. But what do you think?
I think one of the big issues is that people are very bad at thinking statistically. You're probably right in that self-driving cars will actually be a real advantage to people if for no other reason than they won't suffer from driver fatigue and will probably be quicker to react than people will be on the roads. I think it's in some sense more fun to think about the scarier topics. But I agree with you that there is a lot of technology out there right now that actually one would not actually have to invent superintelligence with to actually do a lot of harm. And again, I mentioned the novel Demon earlier, and I think that's actually kind of an extrapolation to a ridiculous extent about how one could actually use existent technology to do things like that.
Human beings are just to piggyback on something Chuck said, notoriously bad, not just at statistical thinking, but notoriously bad at accurately evaluating risk, which is why your Aunt Hattie drives everywhere because she's afraid of flying, even though the number of fatalities on scheduled airline flights in the United States has dropped in recent years to close to zero, whereas cars cheerfully kill 30 or 35,000 people a year. And stairs are, of course, the most dangerous thing in the world. I mean, the number of people who die falling up or down stairs or are severely injured falling up or down stairs is staggering. But because they're so deeply ingrained in our lives, and because they're so utterly mundane, our lizard brain is wired to grab onto, but I might get eaten by a shark, I might get struck by lightning, I might get killed by a terrorist, all things that have this minutely small chance of happening, but that because they have this big, scary, flashy narrative attached to them, become the thing that seizes our brain and won't let go, and that we can't, even if we rationally know that our odds of getting eaten by a shark at the seashore, and I say this as somebody who lives on the island where Jaws was filmed, our odds of getting eaten by a shark at the seashore are approximately equivalent to our odds of winning the lottery. And so, yeah, we worry about the robot apocalypse, we worry about Skynet, we worry about the Cylons murdering us in our beds, when in fact, some dangerous clown with a drone and a bit of plastic explosive and a cheap digital timer is probably a far, far greater threat and a far more proximate threat. But it's the equivalent of falling downstairs. It's so right in front of us and so easy to do that we don't even think about it.
I'd like to jump into just for a second and add that an interesting aspect of, I think, what Olaf mentioned was that when I worked on the documentary The Giant's Dream about Brad Bird's first film, he talked a lot about how, in the days of like Star Trek, it was fiction was capable of using science to present an optimistic future, and that we've really leaned into dystopian, all these really negative scenarios and extrapolating science out into some kind of disaster. And I think it's one reason is that it's really hard to write a compelling story without the drama of people running for their lives. And so our fiction is always filled with, like Black Mirror has, I think, one really beautiful, inspiring story in 3 seasons now, of 4 seasons of like really, really grim stuff. It's a great show, but you could see they struggle to present the upside of science or of these ideas. Hi.
My name is Jenny. I just graduated with a degree in computer science last year at the University of Virginia. So right now I'm in New York working as a software developer. So you mentioned science, technology, and society. And so I went to the engineering school at University of Virginia, and we actually require all of our engineers to take STS, Science, Technology, and Society courses all throughout their curriculum, which a lot of my colleagues didn't really enjoy them, but I especially enjoyed the one that we were required to take our senior year, which focuses on ethics and responsibility. And so you were talking about how the law is always kind of catching up to the technology, that technology advances faster than the government can handle it, and how it might be useless for us to go talk on the Senate or go like lobby people to change their views because they're trying to make money basically on the technologies that we have created. So recently, Stack Overflow, which is a website that developers can go on to like ask questions to the community, they surveyed a little bit over 100,000 of their users, and they gained a lot of insights on what they learned from their users. So there was one question that I found really interesting that's kind of related to what you're talking about. So they asked this question, who is ultimately most responsible for code that accomplishes something unethical? And out of all of the survey results, a little bit over 50% said that the upper management at the company organization is responsible. And about the fifth of the results say that the person who came up with the idea is responsible. And only a little bit under a fifth people, 19.7% said that the developer who wrote it is responsible. So at our SCS class, we're basically trying to, we teach this course and it's required for the students because we need these engineers at a young age, We're just learning to think that we should be the ones who are responsible for producing something. Like we need to have more say that, if our boss is telling us to write this and we're like, we can't do that because it's unethical. Like we need to be the ones who first identify and not wait for government to catch up and, we create something bad and they need to now regulate what we created. So I was kind of wondering about your thoughts on that.
It's a thorny question for sure, and it's a question that the Tempe incident today brings to the fore. I mean, the great unresolved legal issue here is who is responsible when an autonomous machine kills somebody, and if it's the person who wrote the code, if it's the person who designed the system, if we take that apportionment of blame seriously, is that in the long term going to suppress innovation and suppress people wanting to go into cutting edge science and technology? Because holy cow, I mean, if you design something that then manifests an unforeseen flaw that you didn't catch and kills 1,000 people at a go, and that could ruin your whole day. And is that going to produce I don't want to roll those dice if I'm going to be held responsible if this thing goes wrong? Or for that matter, if I'm going to be held responsible if some dangerous clown weaponizes this benign thing that I've designed. Human beings having an unfortunate tendency to be able to beat plowshares into swords if the idea takes them. Is that apportionment of blame going to cause people to pull back from inventing new stuff on the theory that, hey, I don't want to have the blood of 1 million innocent people on my hands if somebody figures out how to use this as a weapon.
Yeah. Well, actually, let me, and yeah, I think that's a great point. And actually, let me add on to that, which is that not in this particular accident, but in an earlier accident, I think about a year ago, there was a fatality that occurred because one of the autonomous cars drove into the side of a truck, and apparently there was a driver in the car. They were actually not driving the car, but they drove into the truck because the truck side was painted white, and against a bright background, neither the driver nor the car's systems could actually distinguish the background from the sky. So the question is that a fault of the driver? Is that a fault of the hardware, the software, the people who wrote the software, or of the company for actually building an autonomous car, which could lead to that situation? And I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's a wonderful thing to think about.
That kind of like borders what is blame, right? Like, is
Right.
there someone that we should be blaming because someone passed away, so the family of the deceased will want compensation from whoever's blame.
So I'm afraid I'm going to have to take the blame for cutting this off. I think we're out of time. I've been informed. I want to thank Chuck Adler and Bo Riper very much for this discussion. Let's give them a hand. Thanks for your questions in the audience. I want to remind you that you can check out what we're doing at YHouseNYC.org. We've got an email list if you want to sign up, and we're going to have an event here at Caveat on quantum computing on April 10th. So I hope we get to see you then.
Thank you all.
Thank you, yes.